financial stuff is just, when you have to navigate it all and you don't really have any kind of roadmap or plan, that can break people. And that can really send them into a spiral that's hard to get out of. And we don't want to see that. We want to see you, you know, be able to navigate that in a way that's dignified and that it gives you, the closure and peace that you're going to need eventually to move forward with your life. I was working years ago when I was first brand new in the business. My first experience with this was I was working with a couple that, I kind of fell in love with this couple. They were, vibrant, full of life, amazing couple to work with. Um, and the wife and I just clicked right away. And, she had um, done extremely well in real estate, and he worked for the state, and she was winding things down and had kind of picked a retirement date that she was comfortable with and was getting very excited. And they were very outdoors, type of people, love to hike, love to travel. They had all kinds of plans. We had really, I that's the thing I enjoy the most is hearing about, like, what does retirement
Yeah.
look
Yeah.
like? What are you guys going to do? What kind of fun are you going to have? Are you, what kind of trips you want to take, and all of those things. And so we had shared a lot of that with each other, and I was super excited for them. And the husband was just kind of having a hard time committing and giving me a date when he was finally going to pull the trigger. And so I'll never forget, it was a Monday morning, first appointment of the day came in, and he had thought about it all weekend and then finally, said, okay, here's the date, Stewart. I'm going to pull the trigger and we're going to retire. And, it was, I don't know, 3 weeks after that meeting that I got the call from the wife, and she was absolutely hysterical. And the husband was leaving work that day and got into his truck in the parking lot and had a massive heart attack and left us. And it was devastating. I was only a couple years into my career, and I had just this is the first time I'd ever had that happen, and it really caught me off guard. And because they both seemed like they were in just peak health and peak conditioning, and you know it taught me so much because that lady, that wonderful wife of his, is still a client to this day. I can say 23 plus years later, we still talk on a regular basis. And I really, because of what I'd seen my mother go through just a few years before that with my stepfather, I was able to really step in and, give her guidance. Spent an incredible amount of time just because I truly cared about this lady and really felt like she was family, and spent a lot of time with her and got her, she didn't do a lot of the financial stuff, and we got her educated on what they had. Good news is she was they fine financially, and she was in a good position financially, but you know just going and trying to figure out how did she get his pension, how does she get all the
Right.
things that entailed was not just a learning experience for me, but it was a learning experience for her, and we learned together.
Yeah.
And I can honestly say that over the years, I think about it a lot as we have lots of other recently divorced and widowed people that we've worked with and have come in to see us, and I lean on the things that I learned at that time. But these things happen,
They
guys,
do.
and you have to be real. And we can't just live with blinders on and think it's never going to happen to us, because it can and will. And again, with women outliving men, statistically, the chances of it falling on the woman are very, very high. And you need to understand, some pretty basic stuff. And
Yeah.
that's going to give you, alleviate a lot of anxiety and a lot of stuff the more that you're prepared for these things. And so, let's talk through, some of the the stuff that you can kind of be thinking about as you go through this process. And you want to do all of this well before you do lose a spouse. But like we said, first thing would be is if and when you do lose a spouse, not to make any major financial decisions for at least a year to 18 months. I feel like that is a solid rule of thumb.
Yeah.
The second one would be, document in a very simple, easy to understand way, where bank accounts are, what the account numbers are, where investment accounts are, what insurance policies you own, all of the medical insurance information, all of the, all of the pertinent financial stuff. How do you pay the electric? How do you pay the gas bill? How do you, these very, very simple, basic things, and document that into a format for your spouse. And, just in case, you're not there all of a sudden and they have to learn this stuff
Yeah.
and have to continue to live life. And, the other thing I would say is automate payments as much as possible.
Yeah. I was going to talk about expenses too. A lot of people, Stuart, we hear all the time. It's like people would assume naturally that when, one spouse leaves us, that expenses are kind of in half, right? They're like, oh, it's one person, so it's going to cut in half. But what we find is 90 something percent of the expenses are relatively the same. I mean, you have your living expenses, you have insurance, you have taxes, you have, the things to keep the household running. You've got cars, you've got all the normal things. Maybe there's some less food, but other than that, a lot of the expenses stay the same. So understanding on the front end, if you're, still in a married situation, what the expenses are and making sure both people know what is going to stay the same, right? And having a good grip on that on the front end. So then if something happens suddenly, the remaining spouse can easily manage through that and understand, okay, this is what has to be paid. This is how to keep everything up. This is what it doesn't need to be paid, and really manage through that.
Yeah. Yeah, and so let's talk about some of the financial things that are going to change pretty immediately. So when you have a retirement age couple that are both collecting Social Security, and something happens to one of them, the surviving spouse gets the larger of the two Social Security checks,
Right.
and the smaller one goes away. A lot of people do not
No,
understand.
absolutely.
Okay. So, very important that you understand that the, the larger check goes to the survivor, no matter whose check that is,
Right.
and the smaller check goes away, right? Another thing that we see a lot of times is that, you know, someone has a pension plan.
Yep.
And I can tell you that, a lot of times when they're talking to us about their pension, and maybe they've made their pension election already where they've decided how they're going to receive that pension, they can't tell us or remember if they took life only or if they left a survivor benefit on that pension, meaning, if something happens to that person, does the surviving spouse get, half of the income? Do they get all of the income? Do they get none of
Not
the
right.
income?
Right.
That is an incredibly important thing when it comes to financial planning to understand.